controversial new SAT scoring standards. How are Democrats going to frame the abortion debate in the presidential primary? And President Trump has granted more pardons and commutations. There are some names that you're going to recognize on that list.
So Team Rising is here. Daria Dawson is a political strategist and the founder of Ever Savvy. And Gabby Orr is the White House correspondent for Politico. Thank you both for coming.
Great to have you both.
Thank
So
you.
let's talk about the SATs. We all had to take the SATs at some point. They're now going to be including an adversity score. Now, Daria, do you think that this is it possible to quantify adversity, or is this really just a way for the SAT to save itself from being dropped by so many elite schools across the country?
You know, that's a good question. I would be very curious to see how they come up with this formula. I think it's a good idea in theory. It's just a matter of how will it work in reality. I do think there are things that, students, personal lives can affect how they do in school. Some students aren't privy to certain things, and we hear about the things about privilege being a determination of folks getting into school. We see that now with families that are privileged and paying for their kids to get into these elite schools. So I do think that it's a good idea in theory. I'll be very interested to see how they come up with this formula to actually, label someone between like 50 to 100 of being adversity situations.
Yeah, Gabby, where do you think this, for me at least, this just came out of the blue. I had no idea they were considering this at all. Do you think that Daria's right, that there was this sort of pressure on them to prove that they were taking account of diverse backgrounds, of adversity, and this is the best that they could come up with?
Well, the timing is a bit suspect. We're following this massive college admissions scandal in which there was several instances of fraud during the SAT scoring and the way that was mailed into schools. And so I do think that there has been some pressure for the individuals who are creating this test, constructing this test, to make changes. Although, as Daria said, there are certain things that you just can't quantify, you just can't measure. And when I was reading through the article about this morning, I was wondering, how does this measure or take into account an affluent student who may have studied for hours and hours to get a really good score, but because of their neighborhood rating or their school rating are going to be seen by a college admissions board as just not as worthy as somebody else. You have to take into account privilege, of course, but that could also backfire in certain circumstances.
To me, this move just sort of reveals how bullshit the SAT is anyway. Like this whole idea, truly, that your whole future can be boiled down to like what score you get on this one stupid test.
Right.
And then you add the extra layer of a sort of like bullshit adversity score. And to me, I think it further undermines the credibility of the test.
I think it's also calling out the fact that standardized tests are, as you said, BS and have always been. Even to like the elementary level where students are being tested and schools are being graded, and a grade determines how much money they get from the county. It's just more so like, because of situations like that, inner city schools, get failing levels or below average levels, and those that are in like the affluent neighborhoods get like A's and A pluses.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, how do we figure out, again, I want to give them an A for effort, but it's just like, how does this translate into the reality of actually, like Gabby just said, you have some students who are probably from less affluent areas who are also studying very hard.
Right.
But at the same time, you have those that are maybe from affluent areas that are also studying very hard.
It gets also into race, right? If an agent, and with these adversity scores and with Harvard system, which is recently reviewed, you basically, if you're an Asian applicant, you have to be in like the 1 to 2% of the SAT in order to get the same consideration as a white student who might be in the top 5 to 6%. Now, I know we're talking on the margins here, but in terms of fairness and how all of that is calculated, and then into the culture of the school, is really, really difficult.
And this is, I think, one of the reasons why you saw the director of undergraduate admissions at Georgetown say that, college admissions is more of an art than a science. And we don't just take into account an SAT score, we look at personal essays. Those are things that really can get into a student's background, the adversity that they face. Those, I think, are probably a lot more valuable than an arbitrary system that the SAT comes up with.
Here's the problem with all of it, and there's a book called Dream Hoarders that really gets into this concept that, like, you know, okay, yes, right, the college admission, the essays and all this stuff, but then you have parents who have been like grooming their kids for this process from the time that they are literally toddlers. I mean, having lived on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, I saw this firsthand, right? You pay to get your kid in the best play group so they can get in the best preschool, so they can get in the right school, and then you hire the, you know, the test prep and the tutors and all of that. And the more that you have this massive inequality in the country, the less that any of these metrics are really going to get to like what someone's actual intellect and merit and ability and ability to succeed in the economy are.
Right.
So.
Well, you know, we also have another controversial topic, which is roiling the debate in this country. There have been new laws that have been passed in Georgia, Alabama, and I think new consideration in Missouri and Ohio on the topic of abortion. And it goes to whether a heartbeat bill or an outright ban in most cases in Alabama. Now, the House Majority Leader, or the House Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, addressed this, and so did the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi. Let's take a listen.
I believe the most precious gift God gives us is life. And I defend my pro-life position for my whole political career. But in my whole political career, I also believed in rape, incest, or life of the mother. There was exceptions. That's exactly what Republicans have voted on in this House. That's what our platform says. And I believe that's the point of what you find many of us of where we stand.
It's really, I don't want to be a fearmonger, but I do believe that they're trying to go on a path that will totally dismantle Roe v. Wade, and we have to be vigilant and express our concerns on this legislatively and at the grassroots level.
So, Gabby, my question is the president obviously has made abortion part of a centerpiece of 2020, especially on the topic of partial birth abortion. But do you think his ultimate goal is to dismantle Roe versus Wade? Is that what the White House officials have told you?
The White House won't get into that. I mean, if you ask anybody, of course they have sort of this litmus test behind the scenes that they want to appoint pro-life judges, not only to the Supreme Court, but to appellate and district courts as well, knowing that a lot of these bills that we're seeing are going to be overturned in the lower courts and make their way up to the Supreme Court. I do think that the White House is excited about what's happening. They look at this and say this is one way that President Trump is fulfilling his promise to his supporters. He had the support of a lot of evangelicals, a lot of conservative Christians, mainly because they are very pro-life. They wanted him to appoint these judges knowing that there would be something good to come of it. And it's really the nightmare of a lot of the president's critics. I mean, exactly what they feared is happening, that the president has had a record number of judicial appointments, and now we are seeing these Republican state legislatures respond to that by passing these bills, knowing that they're going to make their way through the courts. And I think if you ask a lot of Republican lawmakers in Missouri, in Alabama, their ultimate goal is certainly to overturn Roe, but the White House just won't go that far at this point.
Yeah. Daria, on the flip side, you know, this is certainly injected abortion into the political debate, period. And on the Democratic side of the aisle, you have some candidates in the primary who are probably more comfortable talking about that and some who are probably less comfortable talking about that. I mean, how do you think abortion is going to play into the primary this year? Do you think it'll be a sort of major topic of conversation, or do you think it's something that a lot of Democrats will try to avoid?
You know, I will say this, elections have consequences. We all know that, we all say that. And I say that to say, as we're seeing this happen on a state level, you know, state rep elections are important, state senate elections are important, gubernatorial elections are important. And I think that Democrats and progressives lost sight of that. We got really excited about who we had in the White House between 2008 and 2016. And I feel like the Republicans had a long-term game. And I feel like the court system is a part of that long-term game. We are seeing now President Trump has now appointed 2 Supreme Court justices. And like Gabby just said, on an unlimited amount of federal, you know, system justice, federal court justices. And I feel like that was not a part of the conversation in 2016. I feel like I'm still waiting for Merrick Garland to still be confirmed as a Supreme Court justice, and that's a whole nother conversation.
And do you think Democrats are going to be more lightning focused on the consequence of adding even more conservative justices to the court?
There has to be. I mean, there is just this. What we're learning right now in this country is an American civics lesson. That the three branches of this government are equal, co-equal.
Should be.
So should be, but now we're dealing with, a constitutional crisis in this country. It's pretty insane. But at the same time, how do we change the narrative to talk about the Supreme Court? I feel like that part was not even just the Supreme Court, but just the court system, period.
Well,
I do think that Democrats should focus on that and use maybe abortion could be the catalyst of that conversation.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of other issues before the Supreme Court. I mean, the fact that we are not even, there are folks who are going up to be confirmed to the court system who can't even say they support Brown versus Board of Education.
Yeah.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
It is 2019, and we can't even say that we agree on a Supreme, a justice decision from 1954. About integration of public schools.
Yeah. Well, and their fear is that if they answer that question, Gabby, then the next question is, well, where do you stand on Roe, right?
Yeah. No, and I think that what we've seen just in the past couple of months, ever since the late-term abortion debate really spilled over, is a lot of Democrats start to talk about the courts and appointing, liberal justices and liberal state judges down the road if they can get back the White House, as opposed to talking about late-term abortion. Because I do think if you see in polling, one thing is more popular than the other. I mean, people are going to be willing to entertain the idea of stacking the courts with justices and judges that they agree with, and less likely to respond in a positive way to legislation that Republicans are sort of painting as extreme. And I think that's why you've seen sort of this rhetorical shift among Democrats. They realize that talking about the courts, actually developing a strategy, is far more important than talking about the issue itself.
That's a good point, Gabby. We had polling here, even from the Hill and Harris X, which showed that actually a majority of people, or majority of the registered voters that we polled, supported the six-week ban. And that was fascinating to me, which is it is a true 50-50 split. I think it was like 52% total either thought that the ban was just right or not restrictive enough. And so going into that, and I think you're absolutely right, that's why the discussion has shifted, and this is what we were talking about for so many days on the show, which is packing the courts is now endorsed by so many Democratic candidates. Kamala Harris, the #3 Democrat in the race, has come out and endorsed the idea of term limits, limiting the number that a president can support. This is becoming a court battle. And Justice Scalia actually feared this. I think he wrote about it in the Casey decision, which is that by making this the focal point of the courts, it destroys the rhetoric around this conversation in the country, politicizing our judicial branch, instead of putting the responsibility on lawmakers to put forward legislation which is acceptable to the American people, especially because this is such a 50-50 issue.
Interesting. Yeah. Interesting. All right, we've got Donald Trump with some more pardons. Dude who wrote a nice book about him got pardoned. Shocker. This is on top of, you had Dinesh D'Souza, you had Joe Arpaio. Those were some of the more Scooter Libby. I mean, he's been Alice Marie Johnson, who we had on the show.
Yes.
Is one of the most incredible, beautiful human beings I've literally ever met. But the overwhelming thrust of the president's pardons have been very political.
Well, I actually have a question for Gabby, because you would have insight on this. What is the process within the White House that goes behind this? I think Conrad Black said that the White House counsel's office did actually undergo almost a traditional review. Was that review actually in place for this particular pardon?
I think it just determines, or it depends on the individual who is looking to receive a pardon.
Right.
There has been, Krystal laughed at this, but really there isn't any formal process. There is for some candidates, but for the most part, it depends on who you know in this White House. Alice Marie Johnson is a great example of this. She, got to know Jared Kushner. She got to know Ivanka Trump. She was sort of the catalyst for the talk about for criminal justice reform.
Right. Kim K.
And sure enough, Kim Kardashian and her husband Kanye West made it into the White House. So I do think that it's a bit of who you know and who is able to catch the president's attention. But there are certainly people in the counsel's office who are working behind the scenes, following a formal process. And I think that's why you've seen, despite the broad case of the president pardoning political allies and people who have been very supportive of him, trickled throughout that are some more traditional candidates for pardoning. I'm spacing on his name right now, but there was a heavyweight champion in there.
Jack Johnson.
Yeah. Right. How could I forget that?
Yeah.
And nobody really expected the president to pardon him. I think that's it kind of threw people off in terms of the president veering away from giving these pardons to his political supporters.
Tip to the American people: if you're going to go on a crime spree, write a nice book about the president.
Well, I talked to Van Jones about this, and he made an interesting point, which is asking the Department of Justice, whose entire job is to lock people up, to then go through and review its own casework about why it messed up in the first place is an inherently flawed system whenever it comes to pardons. So, I mean, is it so bad that the White House is taking full control on this and not going through the traditional process? Because Van is quite critical of the traditional process, Daria.
Well, I would say, look, we're saying, you know, it's not about what you know, it's who you know, and that's very unfortunate. You know, the Jack Johnson thing did throw everyone for a loop, and then to go out and say, I'm going to pardon Muhammad Ali next, and it's just like, what are you trying to prove here? But no, the justice system, I believe in the process, you know, regardless of like who becomes victims of it. I think what we saw with Kim Kardashian and Ivanka Trump and Jared getting involved with criminal justice is a great thing. But again, it's all about playing to an audience of one, as opposed to the audience of the people, the audience of, you know, the system. I'm not sure I'm going to go as far as Van Jones with like it is a flawed, you know, system to have the Justice Department to review. There are things, you know, jury tampering or stacking the jury, or, you know, just, you know, prosecuting not sharing with the defense team. There are reasons where the system could be flawed, and, you know, that's up to the Department of Justice to actually do its own investigations. But at the same time, it's just like, you know, why is it now like, you know, of course the president has the right to pardon, you know, who he feels, but at the same time it's become so political. Like, you literally just have to play to the audience of one. The guy who knowingly illegally took pictures of, like, you know, nuclear, you know, things on a ship, his defense attorney says, oh, he's being treated worse than Hillary Clinton. And that captured the ear of the president.
Well, that was true, actually.
But Jerry's point is, like, you can get it on Fox News,
basically. He illegally took pictures of, you know,
he took a selfie on a nuclear submarine. Yeah, it was bad. He deserved a year in prison.
And that should be a violation of, you know, secretive. You know,
I mean, Daria, to me, there's the bigger point here is you're absolutely right. Like, the president can pardon whoever he wants, got broad powers to do it.
Bill Clinton pardoned his brother. I don't think a lot of us
and that was not, like, Bill Clinton is a shady operator as well, like, granted. But my point
how
is,
long
like,
did he take to pardon his brother?
We did it at the end.
But my point, though, is that there is no, like, you can't legislate or write laws to get around the consequences of having a corrupt person in the White House. Like, there's no getting around the corruption that comes from that. There's no, like, way to constrain that. If you give someone power and they're fundamentally corrupt, they're going to abuse that power. That's where we are, in my view. I won't make it, Gabby. That's my view.
Thanks for joining us.
Ladies, thank you. Enjoy the weekend. Game of Thrones goes to war to settle disputes. Angry fans of the show are trying out a petition.
I need to sign this petition. But cargo pants, can they be fashionable? The answer is no. And they might be the last generation of wild koalas. We'll explain right before we go.